Opening up central diagonals, white immediately stakes a claim for space and initiates development. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for rapid piece activity, demonstrating an ambitious opening approach. Instantly seizing central space, this establishes immediate tension and prepares for an aggressive pawn phalanx. Embracing hypermodern ideas, this flank development prepares to strike the center with piece play, potentially creating dynamic imbalances. Developing the knight further solidifies control over the center and prepares for pawn advances, potentially cramping black's kingside aspirations. Developing the bishop to its long diagonal immediately shores up the fianchettoed pawn structure, creating a formidable defensive barrier. Asserting central dominion, white boldly occupies more territory, aiming to develop a formidable pawn phalanx and control the crucial e4 square for future operations. Solidifying the center and preparing for the eventual pawn break is a sound positional choice, preventing white's immediate central dominance. Fortifying the center and preparing for castling kingside, this establishes a solid pawn structure and allows for future piece development, setting up a harmonious army. Securing the king's safety in this complex king's Indian setup is paramount, allowing development to proceed unhindered. Solidifying the center and preparing for castling, this move brings another piece into the game with a clear developmental objective, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a future e5 push to gain central space. Embracing the center's core, black confronts white's ambitious pawn thrust, creating immediate central pawn tension and forcing a decision on who will control key squares. This move gambles on opening lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and bishop, potentially disrupting white's harmonious development. It signals a desire for active play and may lead to sharp, unbalanced positions where piece activity reigns supreme. Solidifying the center with a pawn push like this locks down central space, forcing black to maneuver around the created pawn chain and potentially cramping their pieces on the queenside. Launching a queenside pawn thrust like this immediately injects dynamism, seeking to disrupt white's central grip and potentially open lines for black's bishop and rook. Establishing an outpost for the bishop on g5 immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and hints at a potential kingside attack, making the e5 pawn a clear target for future pressure. Challenging the bishop's placement now, black seeks to exploit the light square weaknesses that white's pawn structure on d5 and e4 creates, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn breaks on the kingside or center if white isn't careful with their bishop's retreat. Retreating the bishop to safety after provoking black's pawn advance preserves the peace and maintains pressure on the kingside, hinting at a potential pawn storm or an eventual attack on the now slightly vulnerable black monarch. Seeking dynamic counterplay on the queenside, black repositions the knight, aiming to support a pawn push or possibly reroute it to a more active square. This maneuver, while seemingly slow, aims to disrupt white's central control and create opportunities on the flank. The long-term goal is to exploit the open files that might emerge should white's pawn structure falter. Securing the king behind a castled wall is paramount, establishing a vital sanctuary against potential early skirmishes and future king hunts initiated by black's fianchettoed bishop and knights. Developing the bishop to d7 solidifies the queenside pawn structure, preparing for potential c6 and b5 advances while offering the bishop a more active diagonal should the center open. Shifting the knight to d2 aims to solidify the central pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside or queenside, while also freeing up c3 for another piece and allowing the queen to potentially access squares like c2 or b3. The knight gallops to c5, instantly threatening to disrupt white's central pawn structure with its gaze fixed on the d3 square, aiming to exploit the slight imbalance created by the pushed pawns. Bolstering the queenside pawns with b3 subtly prepares to challenge black's expansive pawn structure on the flank, potentially creating long-term weaknesses if black isn't careful with their subsequent pawn advances. Seizing the central pawn, black initiates a bold pawn sacrifice, hoping to disrupt white's tidy pawn chain and activate its pieces within the enemy camp. This aggressive foray immediately injects dynamism into the game, potentially opening lines for its rooks and bishop. The knight's repositioning at e4 targets the e5 pawn and challenges white's central control, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing white to reconsider its carefully constructed position. It's a gamble that could unravel white's setup if black can effectively follow through with piece play. Sacrificing the bishop here unlocks the c-file and creates immediate pressure on black's queen side, forcing a reallocation of defensive resources. The rook's liberation, though costly in material, now forces a critical decision regarding piece harmony. The knight on c3, previously a passive sentinel, becomes a crucial defensive anchor, and its potential departure to c5 ignites a fierce positional battle for control of the central squares, as black aims to exploit the weakened d4 pawn and potentially open lines towards white's castled king. Unveiling the queen to e1 aims to regroup and challenge black's slightly awkward knight placement, potentially rerouting the queen to a more active diagonal and preparing for a kingside expansion while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure. Reclaiming the rook from its exile on d8, black aims to reintegrate this piece into the developing action, simultaneously bolstering the defense of the pawns on c3 and c5, and preparing for potential counterplay along the d-file now that white's queen occupies e1. The rook's activation along the c-file is crucial now, as white seeks to unravel their piece coordination and challenge black's consolidated pawn structure. Black boldly snatches a pawn, initiating a tactical skirmish that sacrifices positional harmony for material gain. This aggressive pawn grab on a2, while adding to black's material count, opens up the c-file for white's rooks and potentially creates weaknesses around the black king if the material advantage cannot be consolidated. The entire structure is now fraught with dynamic possibilities, demanding precise calculation from both sides. White must now seize the initiative, aiming to exploit the newly opened lines and the potential for counterplay before black can solidify their extra pawn. A strategic reallocation of forces, bringing the rook from its passive flank position to a more active central file, aiming to contest control of the file and provide support for potential kingside expansion. Reclaiming lost material while creating a formidable outpost for the knight is the core idea here, aiming to disrupt white's central control and threaten the weakened kingside. Recognizing the need to consolidate his forces after black's aggressive piece play on the queen side, white opts for a defensive redirection, aiming to protect the valuable a2 knight and prepare for a more organized defense of his castled king. Intensifying the central struggle, this pawn thrust boldly challenges white's king's flank, seeking to unravel white's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch. Clearing the rook's path, the king's file becomes a potential launchpad, forcing black to reconsider the safety of that exposed queen on d8. The rook's repositioning to the open e-file aims to contest control and potentially target white's somewhat exposed king later, while also preparing to support the advanced e-pawn's advance should opportunities arise. White is desperately trying to unravel the tangled situation, shifting the queen to a square where it might offer some defense and prepare a potential counterattack down the c-file. But it feels like a reactive measure rather than a proactive strategy, considering the pawn on e4 is still a thorn in white's side and black's pieces are well placed for future advances. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black ignites a bold counteroffensive, seeking to shatter white's centralized control and expose the enemy king. This ambitious pawn thrust is a double-edged sword, aiming to create attacking chances at the cost of weakening the dark squares around the black monarch. A determined effort to claw back some initiative and disrupt black's growing sphere of influence, seeking to create a queenside pawn vacuum or force concessions. The rook's repositioning to the open f-file aims to contest control of that crucial pathway and potentially support a later advance of the f-pawn, aiming to break open lines for the black pieces. Establishing a more robust kingside defense and preparing a potential expansion on the kingside by bolstering the pawn structure, while simultaneously freeing up the f-pawn to participate in the unfolding battle for the center and potentially target black's exposed rook. Black endeavors to bring the rook into a more active central position, preparing to contest the open e-file, but risks allowing white's pieces further ingress. Shifting the monarch to g2 strategically consolidates the king's position, creating a safe haven from potential pawn storms and central threats, while also preparing for a potential pawn push on the kingside if the opportunity arises. This knight's journey to d3 creates a fascinating positional tug-of-war, a delightful illustration of how seemingly passive pieces can suddenly become engines of disruption. Observe how black leverages the newly opened file for the rook and subtly threatens to exploit the exposed white king's somewhat precarious shelter, forcing white into a defensive posture. The entire structure now hinges on white's response to this audacious repositioning. A single misstep could easily lead to a cascade of tactical possibilities. Initiating a rook maneuver to reinforce the kingside, this repositioning aims to bolster the king's safety amidst black's encroaching pawns and the potential for a decisive pawn push on the kingside. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black ignites the central battlefield and challenges white's seemingly stable pawn structure, creating immediate tactical complications. Unleashing a tactical storm, the pawn grab opens lines and forces black into difficult defensive calculations, fundamentally altering the piece relationships and exposing potential weaknesses in white's own structure if black can exploit the active pieces. The rook's triumphant return to the f-file cracks open the king's shell, aiming to dismantle the white defenses with its partner on the d-file. Pressuring the kingside pawn structure, white endeavors to pry open the h-file, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed monarch, while simultaneously creating defensive weaknesses around the king's sanctuary. Embracing the chaos, black dares to push the g-pawn, creating a dangerous open path towards white's castled king, a bold gamble seeking to dismantle the defensive structure at any cost. Initiating a forceful advance up the f-file, white seeks to exploit the weakened dark squares and create immediate threats against black's exposed monarch. Unleashing the rook on the h-file now throws the king's protective screen into disarray, inviting a cascade of tactical complications that could unravel white's entire position if the king is not carefully shielded. Pushing the rook to the open file, white attempts to consolidate their forces and potentially target black's exposed king, though the immediate advantage of this placement is debatable given the knight's secure outpost on d3 and the pawn structure on the kingside. Unleashing the rook onto the 7th rank creates an immediate threat to the enemy king, aiming to pry open the kingside further, but it leaves the knight on a6 uncomfortably isolated, potentially becoming a target for white's consolidating pieces. The rook's relocation to f1, mirroring black's previous action, aims to challenge the open file, creating a dynamic battle for control and potentially setting up a future knight sortie. The persistent black rook on f8, mirroring white's last action, seeks to consolidate its influence over the open f-file, aiming to pressure white's vulnerable king and potentially join in a coordinated attack on the kingside should opportunities arise. The kingside pawn structure is being fundamentally altered, opening pathways and creating new possibilities for both sides, though white's king now feels increasingly exposed to the advancing black pieces. Unleashing the rook from its defensive cocoon, black initiates a daring raid along the g-file, seeking to dismantle white's pawn shield and expose the king. Opening the f-file creates dynamic complications, potentially exposing your king to a more direct assault, while simultaneously offering a chance to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize control of that crucial open column. A desperate counterattack erupts. Black unleashes a knight check, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially salvage something from this precarious position. The knights dive into the heart of white's camp, while seemingly reckless, forces white to address the immediate danger, potentially opening up new avenues for black's remaining pieces. This move sacrifices material for initiative, a bold gamble when seemingly outplayed positionally. Opening up the king's path, this decision allows the enemy knight to penetrate deeper and directly challenge the monarch's safety, potentially creating immediate tactical threats that demand urgent defensive attention rather than further positional maneuvering. A bold thrust to expose the enemy monarch, seizing an opportunity to dismantle white's central defense and create chaos. Exposing the monarch to this kind of pressure, especially after a series of exchanges that have opened lines, feels incredibly precarious. The pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's burgeoning coordination and create immediate threats, but it comes at the cost of weakening your own king's shelter. Challenging the center with a pawn thrust, this squares the knight on d3, preventing its dangerous advance to f2 and maintaining tactical pressure. Reclaiming the central file offers a chance to disrupt black's advancing pawn phalanx. Black's audacious rook lift dramatically reshapes the pawn structure, creating a highly unbalanced dynamic where attacking prospects on the kingside are amplified, though it does leave the 7th rank somewhat exposed to white's queen and knight. Probing for weaknesses, the knight's repositioning to f3 aims to exploit the open g-file and prepare a potential kingside assault, subtly hinting at a shift in strategic focus from the queenside skirmishes to the more direct threat on the enemy monarch. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance aims to disrupt white's already strained kingside defense, creating immediate attacking possibilities by opening lines and preparing a potential breakthrough. The knight's sacrifice at e5 cracks open the king's defenses, exploiting the exposed g5 pawn and the black king's precarious position. A desperate attempt to reignite activity, sacrificing the rook for a fleeting initiative and opening up dangerous lines towards the white king. A bold decision, sacrificing a piece to disrupt black's kingside coordination. Black's recent aggressive pawn pushes and piece activity have created a rather chaotic position. White's king's safety is questionable, and the rook on the 3rd rank seems somewhat misplaced. By advancing the knight to d7, white is aiming to simplify the game and exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This move forces black to decide whether to recapture with the pawn or the knight, potentially opening up lines or creating doubled pawns. It's a tactical gamble that could lead to a more favorable endgame if black isn't careful. White is betting on being able to neutralize black's initiative through exchanges and a more solid setup. Disrupting the pawn chain and luring the knight into a potentially exposed central position, this move forces white to make immediate concessions, creating dynamic imbalances. King safety is paramount as the open files begin to swallow the monarch. A desperate attempt to find shelter, but the dark squares around this king are alarmingly weak. The recapture of the rook on f1 finally brings some order to the chaotic center, but white still possesses a dangerous passed pawn on e5 that requires immediate attention. The recapture of the rook brings the white king out from its secure castled position, initiating a potentially risky endgame where king activity will be paramount for both sides. The g3 pawn advances, a daring gambit that attempts to pry open lines for the knight and potentially threaten the white king's sanctuary, though it significantly weakens black's own pawn shield. The king's journey to safety appears increasingly perilous with this sidestep, inviting further complications on the kingside. The knight's desperate lunge creates a sudden, sharp fork, threatening the king and pawn on g3 simultaneously, forcing an immediate decision from white and potentially unraveling the already precarious defensive structure.